Thank you all for joining us today. As we head into this busy fourth quarter, right, in the benefits and insurance business, right? There's just so much to talk about from a regulatory compliance perspective. I think so many folks right now they're talking about the Medicare Part D notices, the open enrollment requirements and questions, SBCs, right? The new the gag clause prohibition compliance attestation that's due at the end of the year on December 31st. But I think one of the areas that we've been answering so many questions on and really speaking to our clients about recently is really the increased costs and complexities of offering reproductive health care benefits on your plan in this post Roe Dobbs era that we're now in. And while many of the conversations many of those conversations obviously happened last summer in the wake of the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. A lot of those conversations were about how plans can cover abortion and reimburse travel and lodging, and we're going to talk about those today. The cost of offering other contraceptive and preventive services and gender affirming care and gender transition coverage, those are real costs, right? Those are real things that are coming up in the years ahead, and that will be impacted by the environment. So the political environment, the environment in government, and just from speaking with some of our carrier contacts, I mean, the average cost for an average self-insured plan for just adding gender affirming care and gender transition can be in the range of $70,000 to $100,000. The average gender transition surgery, just the surgery component of that, comes out to approximately $100,000 of claims costs. So these are real costs, right? The decision to exclude or to add that coverage has a real impact. And so, right, what could change these things? Well, obviously, one big thing is that we're now heading into this new political cycle. And as the debates begin for the 2024 presidential election and politics, whether we like it or not, it's going to have a real impact on what happens to our healthcare benefits and the costs. So that's why I couldn't be happier to have two real experts when it comes to inside baseball, Washington, D.C., and what's happening in politics and government. Joel Wood and Joel Kopperud of CIAB. So, Joel's welcome. Thank you both so much for joining us today and for weighing in on these topics, where you think these things might be heading, in the months ahead. It's really great to have you guys.
Hey, thank you so much, Dan. Again, by way of introduction, I'm the president of the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers. It's an organization I've been with for 31 years, occupying the space that my colleague Joel Kopperud, the other Joel, now has as the head lobbyist. I've only been the president for the past 9 or 10 months or so. We represent about 175 member firms, corporate synergies, foundation risk partners. Been incredible members of ours for a long time, and we've known Dan for many years and know him as one of even to us has been an incredible resource as one of the top ERISA compliance attorneys in America. So pleased to join. Our line as a trade association is that among the 174 million or so Americans that receive their health insurance through their employer, our member firms sell or are the consultants to 2/3 of those plans. So even though most of our member firms' revenue is derived from commercial property casualty, it seems as though the overwhelming majority of the issues that we work on, PBM reform being the top one right now in Congress, are on the benefit side, because that's where the existential threats have really been, especially post ACA. So these are big issues to us. Now, neither one of us, this is the Dan show, neither one of us are ERISA lawyers. We both are heavily involved in the politics of this stuff, and hopefully we can give you a couple of insights. But one thing I'm enormously sensitive about, my wife had asked me to do something with her at lunch today. And I said, no, I've got this webinar. And she asked me what it was. And I told her what it was. And she said, 3 white dudes? Really? and so I'm very sensitive on that front. And just hopefully we can contribute in.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And just to get it out there, I'm a loud, proud member of the LGBTQ community. So I'm very deep in all of this. I'm very familiar with the politics surrounding this. There's no insurance organization in Washington, D.C. that's closer to the political pulse than us. We are plugged in on the left, the right, the House, the Senate, Democrat, Republican. We are we've been fighting since the ACA to preserve the marketplace for employer-sponsored insurance. Ever since then, getting through the ACA, realizing that the industry is still strong, we're going to continue to stay vibrant. Our focus has been on lowering costs for your clients to make sure that everyone stays in the marketplace. So that's where our focus has been. But there's been a lot of twists and turns and nuances, and especially since the Supreme Court ruling. So we're navigating this and following it, and hope that we can provide some good insights.
You did a pretty decent job of getting yourself off the hook there, but anyway, just wanted to lay that.
Thank you.
I mean, again,
no,
Dan,
that's great. No, of course, that's great. Thank you so much for that, and just to give some more context here. And so I think that's definitely, I think we're all on the same page, right? The costs are a big thing here, right? A big part of what we'll be talking about today is really, what do these changes mean for you and for your plan and for the costs, right, for your next renewal. And that's great. So today's agenda, this is just what we're going to be talking about. The changing laws and regulations in the areas of abortion and medication abortion, contraception and ACA preventive services, which include other healthcare services. We're going to look at a recent case that's calling into question whether all of those ACA preventive services will be in play next year. Then we're going to talk about gender transition and gender affirming care, which is kind of a new kind of emerging thing that's happened. Once after in this sort of post-Roe world, right after Roe v. Wade was overturned, a lot of states came out and really made a lot of changes, making it harder for minors under the age of 18 to get access to those coverages on health plans. And then of course we're talking about kind of what, how you navigate this as a plan sponsor in your HR and benefits departments out there. And of course what we just talked about, right? How will government and political changes that are happening now and that we anticipate that will be happening soon, how will those things impact these? And I think that's kind of the unique take today that we'll be looking at. So, right, the big three, right? This is the big three, the big areas where we do see, major changes happening both at the federal and state level. And so these are the areas where I think we're going to be really focused on and we're going to be looking at most closely. So just to get us kind of started here, right? Regardless of your political background, and we don't, regardless of whatever your politics are, I think one thing is definitely clear. That is that the new justices that came in, that were appointed during the Trump administration, are conservative, right? In many ways, they've, maybe emboldened or made it easier for a lot of state legislators to add new state laws and ordinances that make it more difficult for individuals to have an abortion, to have access to medication abortion, and to get access to contraception and gender transition and gender affirming care coverage. So I think it's kind of the backdrop, right? I think it's kind of just sort of the, where we are right now, and why we're seeing a lot of the changes. I think this is really one of the major catalysts for why we're seeing so much change across the country right now, that's going on out there. Anything you guys want to add to that, or kind of what?
I just don't think you can underestimate the potency of this issue. Just yesterday, one of the leading White House advisors, quoted in Politico today, was saying that, Democrats should take a deep breath and not worry so much, because the election will be about, number one, Trump, and number two, about Roe. And we certainly saw the backlash. I think Kansas was the one where everybody was like, whoa, it was like a 19 percentage point difference on that that referendum. My one little prop, many of you may have seen the Sunday New York Times Magazine just this past Sunday, and the question on it is, could abortion rights become more secure after the fall of Roe? And it's basically about how in some red and many purple states, the surprising answer to that question may be yes. And so, I'm sure, Dan, you'll get to the issue of where the states stand in all of this and where legally we stand in all this. But in the 14 months since the court issued its opinion, 15 states have done nearly total bans, and 2 states have done this 6-week ban. And I'm probably poaching some of your material here, Dan. But in that same time frame, a result, a series of ballot initiatives have revealed that popular support for the decision is stronger, or for abortion rights is much stronger than had previously been expected in some red and a lot of the purple states. So,
yeah, I think you really summed it up. The only thing I would add to that is every single election that has happened since this court ruling has benefited the pro-abortion rights movement. And I've got a quick list, and this isn't all encompassing, but it really started with a special election in New York last year. Then it was in Kansas. Then it was in Alaska. Then we had the November congressional election. That's not insignificant. Then we had an election in West Virginia. We had a state ballot in Ohio. We had an election for a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin. These are red states and purple states, and this issue is driving it. And so we've got to navigate the way the law is now, but I think this is going to be a complex issue for some time.
I see the question from Jill, what happened in Wisconsin that would change things? There was there was a huge effort to defeat the liberal candidate for the state Supreme Court there, and again, mostly on the basis of abortion rights. She was elected. And
there was a separate issue in Ohio where they wanted to just raise the threshold for changing the state constitution. And quietly, everyone knew that that was actually all about abortion rights and the ability to change abortion rights law. And that referendum to change the threshold to change the state constitution failed because of the Roe movement. So it's a really, really powerful force.
I think the next one, the last comment here, because I know you've got a lot of ground to cover, Dan, is that keep an eye on this fall's in November's elections and state elections in Virginia for the state legislature, because Glenn Youngkin's total control of state government, the state house is controlled by Republicans and the state Senate by Democrats. And there's a massive effort by Republicans. But this, again, I think may demonstrate the potency of the abortion issue. Back to you, Dan. Sorry.
We could go.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. That's great to get that context. And so what I thought would be helpful to just do before we kind of get into the real weeds of things, right, is just to kind of give a kind of a big picture or bird's eye view of the kind of the timeline of major developments when it comes to our first topic. We'll be talking about abortion and medication abortion, and just to give some background, what if you're wondering what medication abortion is, it's a taking a pill to induce the abortion. It's one of the active drugs that's a part of that is called mifepristone, and there's currently a litigation that's going on right now about access to mifepristone, the abortion pill, and where that's going to go. So that's been kind of the more recent stuff that you see kind of on the right of the slide. But obviously, right, everyone's probably familiar with Roe v. Wade, a Supreme Court decision from 1973. It was modified in 1992 by Planned Parenthood v. Casey somewhat. We'll talk a little bit about that, but right, that changed last summer, June 24th, 2022. The Supreme Court overturned Roe and Casey in the decision Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, turning over the issue of abortion regulation to the states. And then more recently, in April of this year, April 7th, we had two federal district courts come out with opposing rulings on the same day. One district court in Texas and one in Washington State. They issued opposing rulings on the FDA's approval of the medication abortion drug mifepristone. And most significantly, of course, the Texas District Court stayed or halted the FDA's approval. So basically, said nationwide, we're not going to allow the FDA to, we're not going to recognize the FDA's approval of mifepristone. And then on April 21st, Supreme Court ordered a stay of that Texas District Court decision, pending final disposition of the case. So it's, it is something that may go all the way up to the Supreme Court. But right now, what that means is the Supreme Court stay is that the status quo stays the same. So mifepristone is still going to be available, nationwide. Obviously, in those states that have banned abortion, right? That's going to be right. You can't use it in those states, but at the federal level, under the FDA is still allowed to mifepristone is still an approved medication. On August 16th. The Fifth Circuit came out, affirmed in part and vacated in part that Texas District Court decision. So certain components of it, they said, mifepristone can't be sent through the mails, for example, things like that. But that Fifth Circuit decision really has no effect until the Supreme Court weighs in, right? Because of that stay that they issued on April 21st, we don't really know yet if that Fifth Circuit decision is going to go into effect. It really just kind of depends on what happens at the Supreme Court. And then most recently, on September 8th of this year, the Justice Department, on behalf of the FDA, appealed the Fifth Circuit ruling to the Supreme Court. So we're still kind of waiting to hear what's going to happen with access to the abortion pill, mifepristone. But that's kind of the backdrop, right? Big picture view of what's happening, of what happened. And, just to kind of go back to, a little bit more background here, and obviously, Joel's, feel free to weigh in I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly because I think most people out there kind of know what these laws said. But, Roe v. Wade, right? The decision from 1973 kind of came out and said, look, there's a the U.S. Constitution confers a federal right to an abortion. It established a 3-trimester framework sought to balance the competing interests of individuals and states. Saying before the end of the first trimester, a state could not regulate abortion. After the first trimester, but before a fetus was viable, a state could impose regulations that reasonably related to its interest in protecting maternal health. And then after the fetus became viable, which is around 23 weeks, the state could regulate or prohibit abortion, including to prohibit the fetus's life, except where necessary to preserve the mother's life or health. And then in the decision in the subsequent decision in 1992, in the case of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, they kind of changed that approach somewhat. It replaced the Roe trimester approach with a viability-based standard. So under the new Casey test, states could not impose an undue burden on a woman's right to seek an abortion before a fetus became viable, which is, like I said before, around 23 weeks, which is when a fetus could survive outside the womb. And then, as I'm sure, as we've talked about a lot, and last summer was a big decision came out in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, which arose from a dispute involving Mississippi's Gestational Age Act, which banned abortion of a fetus having a gestational age of at least 15 weeks. Basically, an abortion clinic and one of its doctors sued Mississippi officials, challenging the constitutionality of the state law. A district court ruled in favor of the clinic, and the provider the court halted the enforcement. The district court halted the enforcement of the law. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed it on appeal, and the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. Basically, in that case, the Supreme Court in Dobbs, the Supreme Court held that there is no constitutional right to an abortion, so there's no federal right to an abortion. It upheld the Mississippi statute and then left the issue of the regulation of abortion up to the states. And the court noted that the Constitution doesn't expressly mention a right to obtain an abortion, and concluded that state laws regulating abortion are entitled to a strong presumption of validity and must be upheld if there's a rational basis. So basically, just kind of flipped, overturned Roe v. Wade, kind of flipped it on its head in many ways, and allowed the states to come in and impose big restrictions there. And I think one of the more notable things that's interesting, I think, about that decision was the concurring opinions, which I think raised some eyebrows, I think, and it kind of may show where the Supreme Court's heading in the years to come. One Justice Thomas, concurred in the majority opinion, but wrote separately to express his view that the 14th Amendment's due process clause does not protect any substantive rights, and urged the court to revisit its substantive due process precedents in future cases, which raises questions about the ability of the federal government, the future ability of the federal government to regulate contraception and same-sex marriage, which could obviously have a big impact on benefit plans. And then another Justice Kavanaugh, came out and said, hey, I agree with the majority, but, right, he noted his belief that a state cannot ban one of its residents from traveling to another state to obtain an abortion under the constitutional right to interstate travel, which was, I think, a little unexpected, and it kind of was not something that folks were expecting, but that may show us kind of where the Supreme Court may be heading on some of these issues in the future.
Joel, I do think that's, forgive me for interrupting, but I do think
go ahead.
That's right. And it was a bit of surprise that Kavanaugh showed more moderation than had been expected. And I think it's maybe a little surprising too, but maybe not so, that Clarence Thomas is kind of on an island to himself and wanting to use this as a basis to revisit any constitutional privacy rights and gay marriage.
That's, yeah, the gay marriage thing. I would just point to the reaction, the strong reaction from the public and Congress to those comments. And his noting gay marriage, immediately we saw Congress move to codify gay marriage. And they did that with 60 votes in the Senate. And in this environment, when you can't get anything done to get bipartisan agreement on codifying those rights for gay couples across the country is significant. And I think really should underscore how passionate and how motivated these voters are. It's very difficult. I think this is the first time I can remember when the government has actually engaged in taking people's rights away. Usually when you give people something in government, it's well understood. If you give it to them, you can never roll it back. Just think about Medicare, Social Security, any of the entitlement programs. You give people things, it's there to stay. It's very difficult to ration it back. And they did this. And we are now seeing the consequences happening at the polls.
Yep, I think those are great points. Thank you. That's, yeah, I think it definitely is something that's going to have an impact. And while we're on the topic of an impact, right? What are the implications of this, right? I think this is really just more for your own development, but basically, right, it adds a lot of uncertainty, adds a lot of complexity, across the country, right? After the decision, we saw states across the country come out, make it harder to get an abortion. And it really caused a lot of our, clients, our benefits managers, compensation managers, HR managers to scratch their heads and say, well, what do we do, right? What if we're operating in multiple states? How do we deal with this? How do we reimburse travel and lodging? And that was really, right, I think, at the focus last summer, right? And so I don't want to go through a lot of things. I know we've talked about. I know CIB had a presentation on it. We've had presentations on it, but I think one of the first things, just kind of from what do you do on your plan, right, is, if you have, it really kind of depends on whether you have a fully insured versus self-insured plan. If you have a self-insured plan, I think the good news is that you have the benefit of having ERISA preemption. Generally speaking, right, self-insured plans don't have to comply with a lot of state laws, so that they can reimburse abortion through the self-insured plan. There isn't much of an issue. I think what was more complicated was out there for clients with fully insured plans was, how do we deal with this? How do we also reimburse those travel and lodging costs? And what we saw a lot of clients look at were health reimbursement arrangements. A lot of clients with fully insured plans looked at health reimbursement arrangements. One of the big ones was the EBRA, the Accepted Benefit HRA, which has a lot of flexibility, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can offer it with an HSA. You don't have to. It doesn't have as many of those restrictions as the general purpose HRA. There is a limit on how much you can contribute to it. It was initially in the first year $1,800. Now it's $1,900 for 2023. $1,950 is the max you can contribute to it. But we saw a lot of clients go there. I think one of the things was, I think when Roe v. Wade was first overturned, a lot of big companies kind of came out and said, we're going to create like a $10,000 or $5,000 HRA, and we're going to make it really easy. But then once they saw that, I think the Texas had the prohibition on aiding and abetting, had actual criminal liability for aiding and abetting an abortion. Oklahoma also had very tough provisions in their statute. I think we saw those numbers kind of come down a little bit. No one wanted to become the target of those states, and it kind of went in under 2,000, I would say, on average. Probably on the HRAs, but it was something that really caused a lot of questions to come up. Right, what's the right appropriate dollar amount for reimbursement? What are the scope of services eligible for reimbursement? Is this just going to be for abortion? Or are we going to open it up to all reproductive health care? I think there was some concern that that men would not have access to these funds if you limit it to abortion. But if you open it up to all reproductive health care, then you don't have to worry about allegations of sex discrimination, things like that. There were plan stacking issues, right? If you have a general purpose HRA, you can't combine that with a high deductible health plan HSA plan. So that's what led a lot of folks to look at more like limited purpose things and EBRAs. And then, of course, conflicts with other laws. I think one of the big areas that we got a lot of questions on is how does this work with HIPAA and employment and privacy laws? And I think one of the big takeaways there is that it's really best to use a third party if you're setting up an HRA. Don't try to self-administer it, right? It could create more problems than that's worth, right? Because You're gonna have access to a lot of information that's confidential and things like that. But that's kind of the big picture of what we've been kind of discussing on the abortion front since last summer. But now I think the big question is really, what's going to happen with medication abortion, and the implications of that are really big, because it's not just limited to, right, the one drug mifepristone, right? There's the concern that if courts are going to start to ban the medication abortion bill and to question the scientific findings and conclusions of a government agency, the FDA, on their ability to approve a drug, that's going to make it harder for other prescription drugs to get approval, to get FDA approval. And that's, I think, that at least that's the argument, right, from the Biden administration and those and Democrats, right? They're saying, look, there's been all these court cases that come out, there's a court cases challenging us on this. And it's really challenging the scientific, the authority of the FDA, their scientific processes, things like that. Another big issue that's kind of coming that's related is the banning the use of telemedicine. If you look at the red states here highlighted on this map, these are the states that have banned the use of telemedicine for medication abortion care. Just is making it harder for individuals to get access to mifepristone and medication abortion. One thing we should just mention here is that there's more of a limited time frame. You only with medication abortion, so that's one of the differences between abortion surgery and medication abortion. But actually, medication abortion, that you only really do it up to about 9 to 10 weeks. But one of the things about medication abortion is that it's over 50% of the abortions that are performed in the United States today. It's 53% of abortions performed today are done by medication abortion. So it is something that I think is really something that's really top of mind. This is just really more for your own benefit. I'm not going to kind of read through all the things that happened in the mifepristone litigation, but really, like we talked about, April 7th was a big day, right? April 7th was the day that we got these two opposing district court decisions. Justice Kaczmarek in Northern District of Texas on April 7th issued the nationwide order that suspended the FDA's approval of mifepristone, going all the way back to the year 2000. So this, and then later FDA actions after that in the case of Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus FDA. And that really, and then on that same day, right, the Washington District Court halted that order and required the FDA to preserve the status quo. And then subsequently, I think what's the big takeaway is that the Supreme Court, right, said, look, let's wait on April 21st. Said, let's wait, let's hold off, let's preserve the status quo until all of the appeals are over. And so the most sort of immediate impact of that, right, is that mifepristone is still available, remains available today, and patients who live in states where abortion is legal, they can still obtain the drug in the same way they would have obtained it if the lawsuit had never been filed. But the question, of course, is how do you interpret that state law, right? If you're prescribing the mifepristone into one of these states that's banned abortion, is that technically an abortion? We haven't really seen any case law yet on that, but for now, right, mifepristone will remain available, and that what does that really mean, right? I think from all the other experts, they're out there kind of commenting on this, and it could still take over a year, right, before we do get a final decision on this case. And so, let's just, like, hypothetically, right, what would you need to do, right, if let's just say mifepristone does become banned, and as a result, right, I think the key thing to do would be to really coordinate, right, with your PBMs, your TPAs, your other service providers to make sure your plan knows what to do. Update your plan document, your SPD, your SBCs, revise your benefit enrollment materials, and then, of course, continue monitoring what's happening here with this litigation, as well as administrative agency developments that happen after the fact. Because I think, like I said before, one of the big questions is, right, if a district court in Texas, or courts anywhere really, right, have the ability to maybe question or second guess the FDA's approval process for prescription drugs, I think that's it could have a lot of potential big impacts on health plans. It could raise the costs of other medications and drugs, and really add a lot of confusion and kind of slow that process down. And one thing that I think is kind of interesting here is that it's something I know, Joel, you kind of commented on earlier, Joel K, is that the majority of U.S., according to a recent KFF poll here, right, a lot of the polling seems to show that the majority of citizens out there in the U.S. do oppose criminalizing abortion, and so this seems to be kind of an unpopular thing in these states that have kind of gone so far as to criminalize abortion. So maybe with that, maybe Joel, do you guys want to take it from there, and how do you think this whole thing is going to play out, and how does how do you guys see this changing as the political winds change?
I mean, I think the slide does a good, excuse me if I just jump in, I think the slide does a good job at capturing what, you tell me how it's going to play out. I think the next president of the United States is going to determine the future of abortion rights on this issue, but I will point to, there was the pattern that we just went over previously when we talked about what's happening at the polls. And it's not even necessarily when they're voting specifically on abortion. When they're voting on abortion-related issues, the abortion rights movement always wins. And I just think about that it's going to be the next presidency and the next Congress. Next presidency, to codify abortion, you're going to need over 60 votes in the Senate. And it's difficult, or is it 75 votes in the Senate for a constitutional amendment?
Well, that's for an override. It's for a constitutional amendment. You're right.
Either way, it's very difficult to see how one party is going to get enough support to get this done. When Democrats had full control of the Congress, when Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate, they still did not have the support for codifying abortion because of the divisions on when you determine at what point, where's the line, and they could never get it. So it's very difficult for me to envision a scenario in the next Congress where they will be able to codify this right. But the next president of the United States will determine what the administration can do. But it's a lot of power is forever going to be in Brett Kavanaugh's hands, as to the courts are going to determine how far the administration can go on all of this. It will always go to the Supreme Court, and I think Kavanaugh has positioned himself as a real decider on this.
So the Trump factor clearly is weighing in on this. I noted with interest that Trump seemed to want to moderate his stance. I think because he's the prohibitive front runner right now, he has that freedom. And talking about it in his stunt speeches, I mean, though you never quite know what's going to come out of his mouth in terms of just states' rights, not in terms of active support of bans. And I know you've got an upcoming slide with Nikki Haley, who seemed to win that among the also ran debate. But I've got a really close friend of mine who's a very significant Republican pollster and strategist, guy who pops up on Meet the Press all the time, and he forwarded me a deck several months ago about how Republicans, it was commissioned by the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, how they should talk about it. And going back to that point that you had, Dan, of the 24-hour wait period was popular, as is, some of the viability things and how you talk about it up to the moment of birth, and try to put Democrats on their heels defensively. You know what? Republicans have not effectively done this. I've seen no evidence of any Republican navigating that minefield in a positive political way today.
Yeah, and if you peel back the statistics on this, I find it fascinating. To your point, nationally, the public is somewhat divided on where the parameters lie, but they side with abortion rights movement. But if that, it's not national polls that elect the president of the United States. If it were, there would have been only one Republican that won in the past 20 years. That would have been George W. Bush in 2004. It's state by states. It's 270 electoral votes. And it looks increasingly like there are going to be three major states in play that's going to determine the next presidency: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And it's still going to be the independent suburban woman that's going to decide the races in those states. So how does this play to that specific demographic? And you only have to move the needle a little bit to win enough votes in those states to get the entire presidency. And so we can see, to Joel's point, there is a shift happening with how they talk about this and how they moderate this. that we are not actually for, we are for states' rights. It's going to be all about messaging to the persuadable voters in those key counties.
So always note, inside the Beltway, Washington conventional wisdom, which is all that we rely upon, is almost always wrong.
Yeah.
And number two, there are 10 million news cycles between now and then. But
that's actually very true.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think I should mention the other side of that argument. So I did mention the argument from the Biden administration, right, that this kind of undermines the authority of the FDA and the ability of the agency to, to take, to employ and utilize their scientific and other expertise in the drug approval process. But on the other side, I think that they have arguments as well, right, that, if this drug can be easily mailed anywhere in the country, right, that kind of undermines their the authority of the states, right? It's a states' rights issue, right? The authority of the state to ban or severely limit abortion in their state. So I think what you guys said is just really spot on. But I think one of the questions is going to be, well, what are the impacts of this? If let's say, the FDA's approval of mifepristone is reversed or something major happens, what does that really mean for other prescription drugs approval? And is that going to add costs? Is it going to add delays? And I think that's something that I think is kind of one of the big, big question marks are still out there. But yeah, I think we agree with what you guys said 100%. I think it's very, very, very accurate. Okay, so let's talk about our second big topic for today, which is contraception. And this one has really been a political tennis match between administrations. So we're going to kind of focus on what we call the ACA's contraceptive coverage guarantee or contraceptive mandate, because that's been kind of the big, the big topic here. It's a component of the ACA's preventive services rules that requires that, preventive services, screenings for women, contraception be offered. And it really kind of these things are defined by the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, which kind of define which contraceptives are going to be offered through health plans at no out-of-pocket costs, right? So no co-pays or co-insurance. These are essentially, what we call first dollar coverage in the industry. It applies to most private health plans nationwide have to comply with the contraceptive coverage mandate. Just as some background here, this is really just more for your own reference. And this has been kind of the rule for a long time now. It's just we're kind of used to it now. There was a lot of litigation when this, several years ago, that allowed broad exceptions for religious conviction and religious, broad religious exemptions. And those things got even bigger during the Trump administration, which issued final rules that really vastly expanded the exemptions and exceptions and made it much easier. And then most recently in February of 2023, the Biden administration issued proposed regulations that would, among other things, remove what the broad moral convictions exemption that came out of the Trump era, and they would also add an individual contraceptives arrangement option. Basically, the Biden administration wants to take this back to the way it looked, during the Obama administration prior to what happened in the Trump administration. And so we were looking at this here at Corporate Synergies, and we wanted to say, well, what would it look like, right? What would happen if, let's say, the contraceptive coverage mandate under the ACA would go away? And if you can remember all the way back to 2017, and there was a lot of discussion of either the Supreme Court or Congress was going to overturn the ACA, get rid of the ACA's contraceptive mandate. And we found, looking back, this is a slide from 2018. This is research from 2018 from the Guttmacher Institute. Only 4 states had requirements that were as protected at that time. Right in 2017, when there was the first sort of talk about let's repeal the ACA, that's when there were only 4 states that had contraceptive coverage guarantees as strong or greater than what the ACA had. And then literally within, this is a year later, right, there were, but this is what it looks like now. Within a year or so, there were 10 states in DC that had those orange states that you see there on the map all of those protected the contraceptive coverage, requirements of the ACA or greater in those states. And so this is what the map would look like if we either see Congress, get rid of this part of the ACA, or a major court decision or a Supreme Court decision would overturn this part of the ACA. And we don't have to get that creative to think about it, because there actually was a recent decision last year in 2022. Another district court judge in Texas, Justice Reed O'Connor, who was one of the justices who had overturned the ACA prior to later it being still held constitutional, but was really issuing decisions to essentially get rid of the ACA. He, in this case, Braidwood Management v. Becerra, there were a number of plaintiffs that were religious owners of businesses and individuals, sued the government, saying that we don't want to offer contraceptive coverage services, and I'm sorry, not contraceptive coverage, just the preventive services components that they objected to, because they believe that the big one was PrEP, the HIV medication, because in their view, the offering being required to cover PrEP violated their religious freedom rights, and they also objected to the delegation of these agencies, in particular the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which, as part of those preventive services rules, can issue recommendations that would, become required preventive services to offer on plans with no cost, with no out-of-pocket costs, right? So this task force, U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, really kind of came under scrutiny in this decision, which came out on March 30th. So the case started in 2022. But the decision came out on March 30th of 2023. Judge Reed O'Connor did a nationwide injunction, right, invalidating nationwide certain of the ACA preventive services requirements that came through this U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which included the HIV PrEP medication and other preventive services, but notably not contraceptives and vaccines. So just to kind of give that big caveat there. The decision had no impact at all on contraception, but there was a concern at that time, and which remains a concern, that on appeal to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, they could maybe get rid of all of these preventive services, or a larger selection of the preventive services, and get rid of the contraceptive coverage mandate. And so, as of now, like, where are we right now? Well, the current status of it is that on June 12th of this year, the departments, the agencies that oversee this came up with a settlement agreement with the plaintiffs, and the Fifth Circuit issued a stay of that Texas District Court decision until there can be a final decision, until the Fifth Circuit issues its, basically until it kind of goes until the Fifth Circuit can issue its decision. But there's a lot of folks out there saying this could really go to the Supreme Court. And so I think, so the big takeaway here, right, is, okay, for now, all of the ACA preventive services are still preventive services that have to be offered without cost sharing. There's no, certainly nothing affecting contraceptive coverage, at least as of now, right, for now. But it's possible that after this Fifth Circuit Court decision, there may be a broader spectrum of preventive services that are invalidated. And so, what I think immediate takeaway is, right, if you're a plan sponsor, you're in an HR benefit department, right, I think it's just important to be aware of the fact that not all the preventive services will, be around, at least based on the Texas District Court decision. All of the recommendations for mandatory preventive services from the task force that were issued on or after March 23rd of 2010, all of those would be invalidated if the Fifth Circuit, affirms the district court's decision. But I think it's important to understand that, look, this thing could go all the way to the Supreme Court. So, you still have to be careful, right? If the Fifth Circuit issues a decision, it's probably not a good time to make changes to your plans, because it could go all the way, to the Supreme Court, and there may be other agencies, or there may be other things that could change the rules, if something like that were to happen. So, obviously that if you do want to make the change right after the Fifth Circuit issues a decision, I think it's just important to understand, what the scope is of the preventive services that are going to be, overturned or invalidated. Understand that could impact, of course, your SBC requirements and, of course, hiring and retention requirements if it's something that your organization wants to do to get rid of those. Of course, we don't have to worry about that for now, but it is something that I think that is really called into question. Something that we've had for a long time now, right? This went into effect in 2012. This is actually a very interesting slide here from Kaiser Family Foundation, showing that the share of insured women reporting spending any out-of-pocket spending on oral contraception. You can see the number goes from about 24%, basically down to 2.7% in 2016. So virtually most insured women are not paying for most of their contraception, and to go back, I think, would probably be a pretty unpopular thing. In fact, we have some other stats here to show you. Another KFF poll showed that the majority of folks, across party lines, have a favorable opinion of no-cost preventive services. I'm not sure exactly how this might be different if it was just focused on the contraceptive mandate, which has been unpopular among religious employers and churches, things like that. But just looking at it from the sort of larger perspective of ACA preventive services, that they are favorable or somewhat favorable or very favorable, by almost all of the across party lines there. So,
hey, Dan,
Joel,
could I?
you want to go? Yeah.
Could I just ask? I think Jill Neff had an interesting question just on that. And I'm curious as to what is going on with respect. Are you seeing in the marketplace with respect to PrEP, and how much of this is dependent upon state by state rulings? I know that we are in the DC Health Exchange, and some of our plans have it, and some of them don't. I don't know what's been emerging or what you've been seeing in that marketplace.
Yeah, I I actually probably have not heard very much at all about that. But
got it. This one.
Yeah, I know among religious employers, from everything I've been reading, that's the HIV PrEP is very objectionable to them. They don't want to have to cover it. And we're seeing a lot of things kind of similar to those types of employers to what the early days of the contraceptive mandate is kind of the way it goes. Yeah, sure. And so, how do you guys? There's the Nikki Haley slide. There it is. So,
sorry, I jumped in.
So, how do you guys see things changing? Right, we have different president, different what would happen if Congress switched? I mean, how do you guys see this kind of playing out?
Well, on the contraceptive front, Trump ran in 2016 very strongly on blanket religious exemptions and allowing any business that had any objections on the contraception front. And I don't expect that Donald Trump, the candidate, will be any different in 2024. Again, you can sort of march through all the other candidates, but I just assume that Trump is the nominee, given just the every polling that doesn't show anybody within 15 to 20 percentage points of him. So I expect that this will be a referendum on those issues, and I would expect to see similar. If Trump somehow were to be elected, I can hear the collective groans on the call from some. But if Trump were to be elected, this is we would see what we saw coming out of HHS and labor and CMS on this all over again.
I think that's right. I agree. The previous slide I thought was interesting, Dan, which divided up the independents, Republicans, Democrats. It's worth noting, and this is one of the reasons that Donald Trump is running away with the nomination, is there has been a mass exodus of voters identifying as both Republicans and Democrats in recent years. And we have more registered voters identifying as independents than at any point in modern history. By today's standards, there are 49% of registered voters identify as an independent, 25% identify as Republicans, 25% identify as Democrats. That's a record high of independents. Now, of course, those independents come from either the left or the right, so they skew, right? They're not true independents. They're probably lean R or lean D. But that makes these numbers, you've got to keep that in mind. So the vast majority, knowing that, the vast majority identify as independents, 25% as Democrats, 25% as Republicans. So that really erodes, I think, the margin for Republicans' support in a lot of these polls. You just have to keep that in mind when you look at all of these data points. It's also worth noting, we talk a lot about where is Biden and where is Nikki Haley or Trump. Where's Joe Manchin? Because there's a third-party movement, and they are working, the No Labels movement is working now to secure a spot on the ballot in all 50 states, and they will probably have a spot on the ballot in all 50 states. They intend to nominate a candidate to be president in April in Texas, and all the rumors are that candidate could be Joe Manchin. And Manchin has made it clear, no matter what race I run in, I am going to win. And he hasn't decided whether or not he's going to run for Senate in West Virginia or whether or not he's going to run for president of the United States. If he runs for president of the United States, he's running based on all that data that I just shared, saying the vast majority of Americans do not want to choose. They don't want Biden and they don't want Trump. They now all identify as independents. And so they see a pathway for an independent candidate. The problem is, as mentioned before, it's not a national campaign. It's 50 state campaigns. And if you go state by state by state, it consistently shows that a third-party candidate is going to pull votes from Joe Biden and will result in Donald Trump being the president of the United States. But there has to be a conversation on where is No Labels and where's Joe Manchin on these issues.
Yeah, and Dan's got a lot more ground to cover here in a brief amount of time.
Yeah, I know we've only got about less than 10 minutes.
But I do think it is definitely worth noting that Ross Perot got 19% of the vote. He got 0 electoral votes, and in 1992 he elected Bill Clinton that year because he pulled the votes away from HW, and so that is a pervasive view, and you should keep an eye on it, particularly with respect to Manchin himself. Fall back to
those are great points. Great. Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you for that. Great. So the last piece here, I know this is our third big topic of the day, and I know we only have about 7 minutes or so left here, but I'll go quick. And a lot of the information here is really just more for reference for the folks out there. But the map changed a lot, right? So after Roe v. Wade was overturned by Dobbs, right, we saw this new trend happening with states coming out and saying we're going to ban gender affirming care for youth up until age 18 because they had strong views on that. So you can see kind of here on this map, right? All those red states are the ones that, that have gone out and banned the gender affirming care coverage. But there are some, states in there that are kind of like little islands or refuges. One of those is Illinois. We'll talk about that in a little bit, which you can kind of see is almost completely surrounded by red states there that are banning it. And they're trying to, in many ways, through their laws and regulations, trying to kind of become an exception to that. But one of the areas that's been a kind of a tennis match back and forth between administrations in this area is a part of the ACA called Section 1557 that bans discrimination in health plans and health programs and activities. And this is, during just to kind of do a real brief recap here, during the Obama administration, they banned gender identity discrimination, in health plans that receive federal financial assistance. At that time, some of the large carriers came out and said all of our plans are going to have to now cover, gender transition and gender affirming care. But then what happened next was under the Trump administration, this kind of went the other way, and they really limited the scope of 1557 and said, well, if you're a plan that doesn't get federal financial assistance from HHS and you're not principally engaged in the business of providing healthcare, you don't even worry about this. So they kind of made such a big exception, it kind of swallowed the teeth, or took out all the enforcement teeth of it. And then more recently, we've seen the Biden administration coming out saying they're going to go and take it back the other way, kind of bring it back to put the band back together from the Obama years, right? And then at the state level, we saw, like I just mentioned, right? Illinois came out earlier this year and said that we're going to be a state that protects our patients and lets them have access to gender affirming care. And so on top of regulations they already had that allowed, that prohibited gender identity discrimination and health coverage, they added this other new law called HB 4664, and which also prohibits the states around them from enforcing their bans in the state of Illinois, which is interesting. And then we saw some more in some other cases in recently, kind of this all kind of even got a little bit more complicated, you might say, when the Supreme Court issued a decision in the famous case of Bostock, applying applying the Title VII Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964's ban on workplace discrimination, said that applied to discrimination on the basis of sex, which included discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation, which made it, I think, a lot more complicated, right, for employers, plan sponsors out there, because now they obviously have to think about, well, if we exclude the gender transition surgery, gender affirming care coverage from our plan, is that going to not only potentially violate Section 1557, but also Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock? So there were some cases. This is really more for your own reference, showing kind of what a couple of recent examples of plans that were found to violate these laws because of excluding that coverage from their plans. So this is really more for your own reference. But how do you guys kind of see this issue playing out? Obviously, we talked earlier in the presentation today that this is going to have probably a very big cost impact on a lot of our clients, our employer plan sponsors out there. But how do you guys kind of see this playing out from a political standpoint?
I'm handing it to you because I don't really know. From an employer standpoint, and this is where we're not advising organizations on what to do. I will say that OPM and the federal government require all of the agencies to develop their own plans to assist transitioning employees, and they all have done that. I just, so I don't know legally where this is going to wind up. All I know is that, it should go without saying that nobody who works hard and contributes to an organization's success should ever have to worry or to feel stigmatized by or ever have to fear going to work. So that's a non-answer.
Yeah, I also have a non-answer. I think it's fascinating how this has become an issue to begin with, because how many people have like, oh, this is my number one issue that impacts my life. But here we are, and all of a sudden it's going to impact employers' lives a lot, depending on where this goes. You can directly tie the movement. This is all part of woke politics. We see it happening, driven by Governor DeSantis. It's interestingly that I just read an interesting article in the New York Times coming into this a couple of months ago about how the far conservative Christian right really was disillusioned after 8 years of Obama and after losing the gay marriage vote at the Supreme Court, or losing the gay marriage battle in the Supreme Court determining the new law of the land. And they found a winner in talking about trans rights and transgender issues. And you can see, if you look at all the polling, the public's pretty divided on this, because there's lots of ways you can spin this. Should trans people be able to compete in sports, depending on which gender they identify on? The bathroom issue. And it's a complicated issue. And even though this might touch very few people's lives directly, the movement has made a very good job at catapulting this to the front of the line. Will this turn people to the polls? I don't think so. I don't think this is going to eclipse the economy, abortion, any of the other issues that are out there. But I mean, here we are talking about it as an employer issue. So I just find it fascinating how it's catapulted to something that's
all of my Republican friends here in this town are kind of done talking about transgender kindergartners.
Yeah, I mean, like,
yeah. Very well. So I guess we could go move on then. But thank you so much. I think we're out of time right now, but I think that as far as key takeaways, right? First of all, thank you both. Right, this has been really terrific, and your insight is so valuable, really, to us and to our clients. So I can't thank you enough. I think some big key takeaways here, right? Politics, changes in government, they are going to have a big impact, right, on the coverages that employers and plan sponsors out there are offering in the year ahead, and really, we're here to help you, right? That's the goal, right? Corp Synergies, Foundation Risk Partners, family of companies, we're here to help you really understand how we can, how these things will impact your plans and the cost impact, and that's what we're here for. And of course, we've got great resources that are, great folks at CIB that are also helping us, and they're just absolutely terrific. So we also, just so you stay updated, we've got a great Health and Welfare Compliance Forum on LinkedIn. We have a Compliance Resource Center with access to our recent e-alerts, on these topics. So check it out. We're here to help in any way we can.